Hi, I am Dr. Kirti Ranchod. I am a neurologist focusing on brain health. So, how do we keep the brain healthy in order to reduce the risk of certain illnesses, such as depression, anxiety, dementia? But more than that, so that we function well in this world, so that we enjoy our lives, so that we have healthy relationships, healthy work environments, and better health. Today, I'm going to be joined by Janine Mohamed from Melbourne, Australia, who's part of the Lowitja Instiute. She does amazing work looking at the cultural determinants of health. So, what do we have within our cultures and our traditions that support health? And how do we support these cultures and traditions? Really excited to be hosting this discussion today. And with that, let's begin. Hi, Janine. Thanks for joining me today. I'm really excited about the discussion we're going to be having on culture and health and how important it is for healthy aging.
Thank you for having me.
Why do you think, well, firstly, is our culture important for health? And if so, why?
Sure. And look, I think in terms of our elders, they're precious custodians, at least in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander culture. They're precious custodians of the cultural determinants, which for us at the Lowitja Instiute, we see them as being vital to the health and well-being of our communities. Our elders are our legacy holders, who make a present and a dynamic contribution to the flourishing of our peoples. The Lowitja Instiute actually funded a research project which is called, and I just have to stop and think for a moment, it's called Sharing the Wisdom of Our Elders report. And in that it says that it's vital we honour and protect our elders and that cultural wisdom. And, among its conclusions, was that we further examine the cultural determinants of health. So the Lowitja Instiute went and created this report with Dr. Ray Lovett. I think it's the first report or piece of research around the globe that actually looks at the cultural determinants of health. We had cultural destruction, which has led to ill health, particularly, around our sense of belonging and our individual identity. And so therefore we need cultural revitalisation. And so we've done a lot of work in the knowledge translation of that report to governments, calling on, a funding stream that actually funds cultural reinvestment.
Yeah, I think why I wanted to speak to you as well was part of the work I'm doing looks at how to keep the brain healthy. And as I was looking at all the research and how to keep the brain healthy, I realized that a lot of it is actually a bit embedded in our cultural value systems and our ways of living, from activities such as mindfulness, so intergenerational living or healthy eating. A lot of it we don't call by those terms actually, it's just the way we actually live. Even the use of art or music or dance, it's just, we don't often look at it as art, it's just so part of the way we live. And so I was very intrigued by your work, actually. And I just want to go a step back for my viewers in terms of what do you actually mean by the cultural determinants of health?
Yeah, so the types of things we mean is like connection to country. So knowing where you're from and what your obligations are to that community as an individual and your role within a family. Respect for yourself and your elders and your community, resilience and how that's fostered. Those are, some of the aspects of cultural determinants. I can give you a really clear example. In this country, for the last 200 years at least, birthing hasn't, well, actually probably the last 100 years, sorry, I should say, birthing has been done in hospitals. And, previously in our culture, birthing was done on country. And I would have my children on my country. I would have choices about how I had my babies and who was in the room. There would be ceremony surrounding that, and it would be, very much a time of cultural expression. But of course, that's all been colonised, and we've lost those practices in some areas within Australia. So it's really about revitalising those practices. Even what you call baby, So we've had very Western names here in Australia, and we've had a real resurgence of using Aboriginal names for our children. So those are some of the aspects of cultural determinants, even cultural housing, cultural education. So you can begin to see that how housing happens. Us being able to own property and build houses are restricted by legislation. So education, at the moment we have a very Western education system that is very much geared on getting a job, and it's industrialized, so creating money at the end of it. But that's not necessarily the way that we would have done education, which is not hierarchical, but more about the community that you lived in, planetary health, and those sorts of commodities, as opposed to learning skills that everyone learns. It would be skills that your community decided you needed to learn to contribute to the community, not to self.
And why do you think aspects of that, like maybe we could just go through certain aspects of the cultural determinants of health that you've listed, such as Indigenous knowledge, and why that in particular is important for health in specific? Like, why do you think it promotes health? And why should we emphasize it going forward?
The cultural determinants in terms of health. So it's a bit like the social determinants, I suppose. Like social determinants are pillars that feed into your, whether you have access to those social determinants or you don't, then results in where you are on the health spectrum. So what we're saying is that the cultural determinants are woven through each of those social determinants. So that's why it's important that we sort of look at each of the social determinants and how culture is played out within those. Why it's important in terms for Indigenous Australia, I suppose, is that we live and operate in dominant culture. So whether you go through a nursing degree or whether you go through your high school education, it's not your culture and who you are as Indigenous peoples aren't reflected back at you. An example for me was that I learned about Florence Nightingale as being, the first nurse, whereas, in my culture, I know that there were many women who practiced, healing practices, and we had our own midwives, yet none of that was captured in non-Indigenous Australia's education. So I think cultural revitalisation is not just good for us to be able to have a sense of belonging and identity in many of these systems, but it's also good for non-Indigenous Australia as well, to be able to see us as those people, and for us to be integrated, not integrated because you don't want a bolted on thing, but that we are included in those systems as well, and that our ways of knowing, being and doing are respected. Another example, Kirti, is that here in Australia, Indigenous Australians have 6 times less likely to get COVID than other Australians.
Interesting.
So, yeah, that's I suppose a really important aspect of how our culture and our ways of knowing, being and doing has really protected us from COVID.
Yeah. Why has it? How has your culture protected you from illnesses like COVID?
I think we're 3% of the population here, so many of the policies that are made by governments are very much based on the other 97%. But what happened in COVID-19 was that there was, it was an emergency response. So governments actually had to do this hands-off approach and let Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities be very much autonomous in their decision-making on COVID. So with their hands off the wheel, we actually had self-determination, and we moved very quickly to ensure that we closed our communities off. We had very much place-based public health messaging, and we have organisations within those communities, many of those communities. That was really important, that those health services were able to work with community around what was important to them. And of course, like many Indigenous communities, our elders are at the centre of that, and we saw them as the most vulnerable in our communities. So a lot of our public health messaging was around keeping our elders safe. And with them being the centrepiece of our community, I think that really helped people's, I suppose, aseptic technique, not making sure that they stayed at home and didn't socialise, that they wore masks. Our workforce in those communities are mainly Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, and if they're not, they're culturally safe health professionals. So I think those are, some of the aspects, but certainly the big part was about, we're the solutions to ourselves, not government. They're not the solutions to us. And when we're allowed to, exercise our own rights and our own ideas, then we're able to, or exercise our cultural determinants, then we're able to, keep our communities safe and healthy.
I think also it's an understanding of the resources you have, right? So you are able then to work with the resources you have, tap into your strengths, and also understand the weaknesses that you have. So how do you protect against those, which you have a better understanding of? I think it's such an excellent story, actually, because one of the other narratives that does come across, I'm sure it affects you as well, but there's often this idea that people in however people want to define it, low middle income countries, global south, however people want to define it, don't have approaches to health. There's just this health wasteland and cultural wasteland. Like, we have nothing. Whereas your story just beautifully illustrates how much resources you actually have and what you can do when you utilize the resources and understand them.
Yeah. And I'll just quickly tell you a little bit about last week, where we launched the Gap report, and we deliberately made it a strengths-based report, because much of the out there about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities is deficit discourse. So it's the problem with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples as opposed to the problems we face, which is a very different positionality, isn't it? And so we've done a great deal of work. And again, I'd encourage you viewers to have a look at our website and look at the deficit discourse report that we did, which really, looked at the national narrative and what was being said about Indigenous communities here. And so we began talking about all the amazing things that we do, because they're underrepresented. That's not shying away from, the issues that we face, like systemic racism, short-term funding contracts, lack of infrastructure. But what we're saying is, in the face of all of that, we still produce great outcomes as Indigenous communities.
Yeah, I'll definitely add a link to your website for my viewers, and I'll have a look at the report as well. So the next thing I just wanted to actually have a better understanding of was any specific Indigenous cultural practices or traditions that would protect health or promote health in different ways.
Yeah, sure. So through this cultural determinants of health report that we've done, there's cultural expression and continuity through art, music, cultural practices, our knowledge and beliefs through spiritualities, or our dreaming, as we call it here, our traditional healing practices, and how we pass this knowledge on through storytelling, and particularly our languages. So I'll probably answer that in two parts. As I said earlier, connection to country is extremely important. And one of the practices that we have is called fire stick farming here, or savanna burning. Some of your viewers might also know of this practice as that. And so it's about picking the seasons, and Indigenous peoples don't believe in 4 seasons. That's something that the English brought with them. And in different places, there's different amounts of seasons, but most places will have up to 6 seasons. And so they pick a season where the community will go out and begin burning off, all of the grasses, and at a greener stage, so there's not as many carbon emissions. But it also means that when fires happen, as probably they do where you are, it's not about will they happen, it's about when they will happen. Then they're more controlled, and they're not going to burn at the rapid pace that we see them burning in the last, I think it was 2019, 2020 in Australia. We had devastating bushfires that really upset the Aboriginal community, because we had not only had loss of flora and fauna, but we had, issues around food security. So our communities being able to access food. We were worried about mums being pregnant and the the smoke in the air. So communities really rose up, but we see it as a preventative measure that we've done for 60,000 plus years. And it's not just about country; it's about climate change, and it's also about protecting flora, fauna, communities. So I think that's one way that knowing the devastating impacts fires has on health, that there's a preventative measure that we take around that. I think the other thing, and which is very important as you age, of course, you return to your language, and also language gives you a real strength. And I think most Indigenous cultures, I don't need to unpack that. We just know that our language is our strength. And at the start of colonisation, there were 250 languages spoken in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities. So that's probably a point to note, is that we're not homogenous in Australia. Australia is a huge country. So therefore, like every family is different, every Indigenous community is different. For the latest data we have through the 2020 National Indigenous Languages report, it found that all of Australia's Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander languages are under stress or threat, and that then less than 10% of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people are reporting speaking an Indigenous language at home. And there's a significant international study that I know was published in 2000 that singled out Australia as a place where languages were disappearing at a rate faster than anywhere else in the world. So we've been devastated by government policies and practices in the past. So really our languages have been silently sleeping and awaiting that revitalisation. So we have this really beautiful initiative here in Australia. It actually, to be able to understand your language and to be able to read it, you have to be literate. And then leading on from that, they can then begin to speak their languages. So there's an overwhelming desire really for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples of all ages to strengthen that traditional language. And it's got, through our work, we've got a growing recognition of its role in health and well-being.
I think I do want to, why would, because the language issue is also happening all across the world, where certain languages such as English are becoming dominant. Not are dominant, but it's accompanied by a loss of, Indigenous languages throughout the world. Why is it important? Like languages used to communicate. Well, why would it actually be important?
Well, I think other than that, it strips away your uniqueness and, your history. How you identify yourself is through your language group here in Australia. So I'm Ghana, so therefore I speak Ghana. I'm Narungga, and I speak a dialect of that. And I think it's, apart from wanting to sound a little bit fluffy, is when you can speak your language, there's just a rising of the spirit that happens. And for our Indigenous elders who went through those eras and are a product of colonisation, it's a real resurgence and ownership of who they are. Yeah, we need diversity, or else we have homogeneity, and that makes for a pretty boring world.
Agreed. Given the need for diversity, and given the work you're doing, and given the intersection between the different health systems and approaches to health, how are you navigating all of this? Because I can see lots of challenges, and I'm not sure that both systems would have the same language even, right? Even if it's English, you still won't have the same sort of language approach. And yeah, I'm just wondering how you navigate those.
Yeah, I think how we're navigating systems and system change is so for the non-Indigenous system, what we're asking them to do is have a look at the system and who's created the system, who has best access to that system, and why that is. So it's really the system gazing back on itself and understanding its own history and what that means for Indigenous peoples. And I'll give you an example. Some of our major hospitals doesn't have an Indigenous workforce, doesn't have an acknowledgement to country on the front door, doesn't have any Indigenous peoples on its board. So therefore it's not inclusive, but unbeknownst to itself, it's exclusive. And then, I suppose, Kirti, what we're saying to our own system is, what works best, and we know what works best. It's self-determination. So we want a growth of what we call Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health services. In those services, it's place-based, it's designed, developed, delivered by Indigenous peoples. But of course we have, they are primary healthcare systems largely. So our peoples, our mob, they have to go and use the tertiary system. And in some places they don't have any choice but use non-Indigenous systems for both primary and tertiary. So we have to make sure that those systems are what we call culturally safe. And that means not that they learn about Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples and all of our nuances and those sorts of things, but they actually know about themselves, and the gaze is inwards, and they are able to turn to their blind spots, like we, did with sexism, where we discovered that women weren't a part of the system, and we rectified that, and look at the beautiful diversity that we have now, thank goodness. So it's the same with Indigenous peoples. We want the system to sort of, look at itself, its blind spots, and really understand where it needs to value, because much of this is a value statement, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples.
One of the other debates that's happening is obviously decolonization of health and health systems. And on the counter argument is that colonization ended some time ago, and therefore there's a point in time where it's over. So what do you think are health priorities for your community or the communities you work with, and why? And do you think that colonization is still having an impact on your culture? And yes, how do you move forward? What are the fears and hopes you have for your culture?
So I suppose, yes, there's probably the school of thought that I live in, which is colonization is a process and it's still alive and well and kicking today. And if you say that, you don't really understand what colonization is, which is, replacing what was with a different system. And if that system still remains in place and it benefits one group of people, then we still have that system in place today. And, everything else is really retrofitting and I suppose window coverings for, what they believe it to be. And it's very easy, right, to have a look inside your house and say, this is great, this is fantastic. But what's more important is when you get people that didn't build the house to come in and tell you how they really feel about it. So, and that's probably leads into your second part of your question, is that no one's listening. So in Australia, we had governments ask us what did we want around constitutional recognition. Again, I encourage your viewers to look at the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which really talked about makarrata, agreement making and historical truth telling. And when we told government this, they went, oh, well, that's nice, but we might ask a different group of people.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit about what's easy, what people want to hear and what's possible. And so for us in Australia, the Uluru Statement from the Heart is, the ultimate goal. And maybe we need incremental steps along the way, but that's not what this government's talking to us about at the moment. So fears in terms of, I suppose that leads on into the fears. If no one's listening, then we're not actually receiving what we're asking for. And those fears, I suppose, result in a loss of our elders if we don't continue on the journey of cultural revitalisation. Yeah, so the risk is that they can never be recovered if we don't act quickly. And I suppose my hopes is that we have a strong and vibrant contemporary culture and that there's no real Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people left. My hope is to see the eradication of that type of statement because it questions us and who we are. So that's probably a very deep thinking one. But that we have strength collectively in Australia around our combined identity and that we want and we will create new dialogue.
Throughout this conversation, you've emphasized the importance of elders in your community and the value that they have. There's been a recent a report released about the stigma related to aging. Is this something that is common or prominent in your communities or the communities you work with?
Actually, no. There's probably, there's not. There is in eldership, there is a loss of, I believe, in some communities, and this is why the cultural determinants are so important, where elders aren't respected and their positions and their voices aren't heard. Through, through some of the contemporary Western culture that comes through, our kids swim in that social soup. So, yes, I think there's a real fear of that happening, but I don't think it's something that we've got to keep an eye on. It's not something that's happening at the moment. And when I say that, my experience is that, probably the hardest, kids or adults to, to talk to are, people in the juvenile justice or in the justice system, and being able to work with them with a lack of hope, for all of the, they don't have a voice in these systems. So, but you see them when our elders go into these systems, this absolute respect and this listening to our elders when they talk to them. And so that's why I say my experience, because I don't speak on behalf of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, is that our elders still have an impact on even the most hardened of hearts, that respect is still there, and they sit up and listen pretty much.
And that's excellent. And I think, again, just so that I make sure I'm not misinterpreting, it is directly linked to your cultural value systems and your ways of living that hasn't isolated older people and hasn't devalued them in a sense, and actually recognizes the strengths for who they are.
Yeah, and they must be at the table. They must be happy with our decision making, and guide us in our work. And certainly my career is only what it is because of the shoulders of giants that I've been allowed to stand on. So one of the quotes that was in the report is a quote of mine, is that, legacy building for me is actually understanding the legacy that I've been left and the honour and the privilege that I have to stand in these positions, and therefore my role in this position, and I won't call it leadership because I have a position and I have a voice, is to ensure that it's not for self in this moment, but it's for my generational echo.
Wonderfully said, and actually feels like advice for me, actually. What advice would you have for my viewers going forward with regard to either the importance of culture and health or healthy aging?
I suppose my advice for anything is that reflective practice, to, look around at the world that we live in, but always be critical of it, and to always recognise what's missing. Yeah. So in Australia, one of the things I get people to turn their attention to is that when they walk through a park, think about who the park is honouring. So in Australia, that's mainly explorers, that came here and were a part of colonisation, or it's judges, or, people, they very rarely see Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander culture reflected back at them. And that's a value statement, again, that we must look for things that aren't there. So that's probably a piece of advice that I would leave you with. And to not feel, for us in Australia anyway, our culture's not dead. It's alive, it's contemporary, it's not found in a museum. Cultural revitalisation is happening everywhere, but it's not something that's valued and funded. So, yeah, and in a contemporary sense, like in Australia, we used to have corroborees, where many different nations would meet together and exchange song and dance and stories.
Lovely.
Nowadays, but nowadays, like for me at least, our modern day corroborees are, coming together at a conference as Indigenous peoples, or coming together at a sporting event, that's targeted at us and our communities. And that's cultural revitalisation, that's strength in that, there's belonging in that, and identity building in that, and that's resilience. If you know who you are and who your people are, and you're strong in culture and identity, you can go out and face the world And when racism happens to you, there's a lot more resilience that is built up there because you know who you are. So I don't know what I said in all of that, apart from really valuing culture in health.
No, I think
What
you
the
said
in.
you said a lot in that, and a lot of value just in terms of resilience and how culture actually feeds into that, and a sense of community that you create by having these things, and also that sense of identity that is so important, because we need to value ourselves as we go forward in the world so that we actually make the choices that are healthy.
But of course, many of our people that were part of the stolen generation, put into institutions, many of those are aged people now. That weren't able to connect with that.
What's the continued impact of racism in Australia on health, or broadly on the society?
So I think the impact of racism on health and into society is far-reaching. But at an individual level, we know the hypervigilance of casual racism, of everyday racism, individually affects people's health outcomes. We see that in, I think it's called cortisol, levels within the brain. I know I experienced that myself, particularly in different settings. If I am in contact with the police system here in Australia, my cortisol levels goes up because I know, and it's evidence-based, that Aboriginal women are highly incarcerated and not believed in this country. So I don't have the privilege of walking in some spaces and feeling safe. And again, I emphasise the fact that that's evidence-based. Even here in Australia, we've looked at, healthcare, which will show that for transplants or for coronary care, Indigenous peoples receive a downgraded care pathway. Historical truth-telling, will tell us that we're a part of, medical experimentation in this country. So things like COVID and immunisation has an effect on the uptake of that because of trust in that system. So, and when a system's, not culturally safe, and you can see it, there's not Aboriginal people accessing that system, there's not Aboriginal people employed in that system, so therefore you can see the ongoing effects of access to healthcare. Australia's an ancient country, and we should be much more mature than this and be able to have these conversations and dismantle racism in all of its form, individual, systemic, cultural racism.
If people are looking at healthy aging or brain health or mental health, what are the priorities that people should focus on? Again, given your experience and where you're coming from.
Look, for Indigenous peoples and from my own experience, and that's the only place that I can honestly, operate from. And I've spoken about two of them today, that you work with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities to find out what their priorities are. There is no cookie cutter approach to policy making and everyone getting the same thing, because equity is about understanding. And in Australia, we talk about, being fair and giving everyone the same all the time. But equity is actually about giving people what they need and understanding and meeting people where they're at. And only through meeting people and where they're at and talking to them about what their needs are will we get equality. So the notion of equity and equality must be understood and must be deployed. And that's through place-based programs and decision making. At an individual level, what allyship is, what cultural safety is, and how to dismantle racism in self as well as in systems. And only through a people movement will be able to do that. They're my two big things.
Thank you, Janine. I think this has been an excellent conversation. You've added so much value to the discussions I have been having. And I say this after every talk, but I get so much value personally out of having these conversations. Like, I learn and I leave with something that I need to either think about or work on, so thank you very much.
Oh, no, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Janine, for your insights. There were several key points that came through for me. I think one of them being the importance of self-reflection and self-understanding to become aware of my blind spots so that I may transcend them. The importance of our cultures and traditions in terms of giving us a sense of belonging and identity, how that leads to a sense of well-being and better health. I really appreciated Janine's emphasis on elders in our communities and our families and the wisdom that they bring and share. So thank you again, Janine. I hope that we can continue these discussions. And thank you to all my viewers for joining me. I hope that you will join me for the next one. Thanks.